Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
So this is the title of the book, and these great episodes of human progress are what I call the Great Escape. This is an escape from destitution, ill health, and premature mortality to the long life and material living standards which people like us in this part of the world enjoy today. I don't really talk about it much in the book, but there's other good things going on in the background too. There's much more democracy in the world than there used to be. There have been large-scale reductions in violence throughout history. There have been huge increases in education in many parts of the world where it looked very, very unpromising. And I'd also argue it's somewhat more controversial that people are getting happier and they think better of their lives than they used to. But many of these episodes have allowed only some to escape. And I'll talk about some of those in detail, leaving many others behind. And so the very progress that has brought us to where we are has been a great engine of inequality because it leaves people behind. I mean, is that a bad thing? After all, it's come from a very good thing, which is this progress. And the answer, as we'll see, or if you read the book, because I can't talk about it all today, is sometimes really important and useful because it shows the way for others. And it shows that this can be done and helps other people to make the Great Escape. On the other hand, it can also be incredibly oppressive if the people who finish up on top do the opposite of trying to help those left behind. The metaphor would be they fill in the tunnels behind them, or if you allow me to switch metaphors, they pull up the ladders so the next set of people can't get up. And that happens too. I think that's happening in the United States today, for example, that the extreme inequality is becoming a very negative force. So let me talk first about, if you like, the episode that sort of inspired this, which is what historians call the Great Divergence. And this is the sort of sustained economic growth, the Industrial Revolution, if you like, which began in Northwest Europe, particularly in Britain, between 1750 and 1850. It sowed the seeds of the increases in material living standards and increases in life expectancy and better health. Now, when I first learned about the Industrial Revolution as a student at Cambridge, we tended to believe that this was a unique event and that there'd never really been similar explosions, or not explosion because it wasn't that fast, similar prosperity, episodes of prosperity anywhere else in the world. We now know, and from modern scholarship, that's really not true. And there are many episodes in history, sometimes quite long-lived, where people were quite wealthy and did very well. Many of these are in China, but not only in China. There are other places around the world where people were very prosperous. And the question now has switched not to why did the Industrial Revolution happen, but why was it sustained in the West? And why was it not sustained in the rest of the world? And that's what historians are still arguing about. That great divergence between Britain, Holland, the rest of the world, has never really closed, even 250 years later. Those gaps that were established then in health and in wealth are still there. And in fact, if you look country by country, with each country being a sort of point, if you imagine a cluster of points in the world, that cluster is not shrinking. That global inequality between countries is pretty much the same now as it's always been, at least in incomes. If you look on a person-by-person basis, it's a little bit different. And in fact, the big difference there is there's 2.5 billion people in India and China, and those people have been getting better off relatively quickly. So if you look at the distribution of people in the world, the distribution of income across people is probably narrowing. So this is where we are now. This is an updated version of a picture that was first drawn by the demographer Samuel Preston in Princeton in 1975. What it shows along the bottom is national incomes, and those have been adjusted so they're supposedly comparable across countries. And what it shows up the vertical axis here is life expectancies at birth. And that goes from like 45 in the least healthy countries in the world up to nearly 85 in Japan. And you can see incomes go from effectively nothing up to people $40,000, $50,000 in the US, Norway, and much of Western Europe. So 2 facts to take away from this picture. Fact 1, there's lots of inequality in health, there's lots of inequality in income around the world. Fact 2, they're strongly correlated with one another. So that the countries that have a lot of money are also the ones that have really good health. And the ones that have no money are also the ones that have really bad health. Of course, there are deviations from that, certainly. The United States up there, you can see, is a long way below that line. And there are a lot of countries down here, Botswana, South Africa, and what you're seeing there is the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which has pulled those countries down. So this is what I call the onward and upward curve picture. The top line is the one you've just seen, and I've superimposed on top of that what the same picture would have looked like if it had been drawn in 1960. And what you can see is, you know, the world's moving up that way, moving up to the top right. And that's terrific, because that's saying people are getting healthier, they're getting wealthier, the world is getting to be a better place. In some ways, even better than that, because the curve itself is moving up over time. And what that means is if you're at a fixed income, even if your income didn't grow, you can still have a health improvement. So, you know, there's been a lot of health improvement that is not purely determined by income, which is a good thing. So even if you don't get some of the income, you get some of the health. So I want now to talk about the 2 great catastrophes of the last since the Second World War, the 2 biggest ones. And the point about talking about catastrophes is just to make it clear that this progress has not been a smooth sailing all the way, that horrible things happen. The first one you've already seen in the previous slide, where you've got these countries affected by HIV/AIDS, where almost all of the gain in life expectancy in the post-war period was eliminated. That's essentially a natural phenomenon in the sense that many epidemics throughout history have come from who knows where, like cholera, like the Black Death. And, you know, the important thing this tells us is we're not exempt. We're not exempt now just because we're rich and live in this prosperous world. This can still happen to us. The other great disaster that you can see here is to do with China. So if you look at China here, life expectancy in 1960 was about 42. In 2010, it's over 70. So it's like a 30-year gain in a 50-year period, which you might say, boy, I knew China's been growing fast, but I didn't know their health improved that fast. Well, it didn't. So what happened between 1950 and 1960 was the Great Chinese Famine. It's one of the greatest catastrophes. There was no weather failure. There was nothing, no natural catastrophe which caused the Great Famine. The Great Famine was a political catastrophe that was caused by Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward and the insanity of the policies during that period. So this is an example of a colossal catastrophe, a man-made catastrophe. It's one of the many examples in the book of what bad politics can do to you. We like to tend to pretend politics is not very important, but politics can wreak the most incredible havoc. All right, if you put this all together over the last 55, 60 years, these organ pipes, if you like to think of them that way, let me explain. The middle line, this is about life expectancy. So the little bar across the middle of these things, this thing here, is the middle life expectancy in the world. It's the life expectancy in the country which has half the countries above and half the countries below. And you can see the sort of steady progress of that from here, median life expectancy in the world, about 50, up to where it is today, which is close to 70. So if you worry about inequality in health around the world, and if you choose to measure health by life expectancy, that inequality is shrinking around the world, which is what this graph shows. I'm not altogether sure that life expectancy is the best metric, and that's because if you save the lives of children, which is what's happening in poor countries, it has a much bigger effect on life expectancy than saving the life of someone who's 55 or 60 years old. Philosophers have argued for a long time about, whether saving a child is worth more or less than saving an adult, and you can argue it both ways. But this shrinking of inequality depends very much on prioritizing children. It's hard to measure health when people are alive, so we rely on mortality and life expectancy, which rest on comparing the living with the dead. This is women's heights around the world as adults. And adult heights are very sensitive to what happens to people in childhood. So if you live with a lot of infectious disease, like measles epidemics or flu epidemics as a child, the inflammation that's generated by those challenges is likely to restrict your growth. So what's along the bottom axis here is income again. Each coin is a birth cohort of women, like the women born in 1945 in a country, and plotted their adult height in centimeters, like 165 centimeters, against the income in the country in which they were born. And you can see there's this sort of onward and upward picture once again, especially for Europe and the USA. And you can see that women in Europe have gained perhaps 10 centimeters over the last half century. It's sort of an amazing thing. I mean, it's not just we're getting better off, but our bodies are getting bigger. And we think that's a reflection of better childhood health is a big part of it. A part of it that people sometimes a bit cagey about talking about is that if you have bad experience of nutrition or disease as a child, it probably affects your brain development as well as your height. And so there's sort of correlation between heights of populations and being smart. And so IQs may be going up with that, and we know IQs around the world are indeed increasing. So this is the health revolution that went with the Industrial Revolution. Life expectancy began to rise in Britain, and it's the birth of what nowadays is called the health gradient, which is that richer people live longer than poorer people. So here's a graph that was first drawn by Bernard Harris, the University of Southampton. This picture comes from Tony Wrigley et al.'s sort of great study of life expectancy in Britain using parish records from before 1550 until after 1850. This is the general population. And the thing that's sort of amazing about this is how little trend there is. I mean, you can find sub-periods when things seem to be getting better or worse, but by and large, you're just hobbling along at 40 for hundreds of years. The big spikes are like plagues and epidemics, things like that, smallpox, Black Death. So what Bernard Harris had the brilliant idea of doing, there's a scholar called Hollingsworth who had spent a lot of time looking at life expectancy among the British aristocracy. Now, the Dukes live in big palaces, they have estates, they have servants, they have a lot more food, they're not short of food. You might have thought they did better throughout history. Well, what happens is this, and this blows me away every time I see it, and I've shown it a number of times the last few days. So. Through this period, they're really just tracking along. But whatever, the amazing thing is not much happens until 1750, and then, my goodness, does something happen. So 100 years after that, after 1850, you have about a 20-year difference in life expectancy between the Dukes and the rest of the population. So what drove that? To me, the best leading candidate is inoculation against smallpox. Variolation, this is called, or inoculation, is not the same as vaccination. Vaccination was only discovered in 1799. And the wife of the British ambassador to Turkey came back to court in 1750, having observed this process in Turkey. And what happens is you scrape a pustule from someone who's got smallpox, and then you rub the results into the arm of someone. They get a mild case of smallpox, you hope, and then they get immunity. This variolation against smallpox had been practiced in China for 1,000 years, in Africa for a very long time. It was taken across the Middle Passage by enslaved Africans to the United States and was much more widespread in the United States before it was used in Britain. And George Washington variolated the whole of the Continental Army during the War of Independence. And that knowledge had come from Africa. All right, so let me now talk about these enormous inequalities that we've seen already. It's mostly to do with infant and child mortality rates. These are the big differences around the world. Children die in poor countries. This is the bit that you ought to think about if you want to generate some moral outrage, which I think is totally appropriate in this situation. These children are dying just by the accident of where they were born. They're not dying from wild, exotic diseases that we have no idea how to cure. They're dying from things we could vaccinate away. We've known how to fix those things for the best part of a century, so why are these children still dying? I mean, it's, if you like, an outrage. In India, half of all children are still severely malnourished. And as Jeff Sachs likes to remind us, if you figure out what it would cost to fix those things, at least if these people were living in Britain or Europe, it's tiny compared with the benefits that would flow from that. So to me, this presents a situation in which we have an enormous obligation to assist, just on straight humanitarian grounds. These people, very poor, they're doing very, very badly. If we can help, we ought to help. So for people who want to expand foreign aid, I'm entirely on their side on the ethical grounds. But I have a practical quarrel, which is that I don't think it works. And I think it does more harm than good. So let me say a little bit about that. But let me start with the positive sides. There are lots of things, because you don't want to go away from this lecture thinking, you know, I don't think anything can be done. I think real things can be done. We could do research on diseases of the poor, like promise to buy these drugs if pharmaceutical companies develop them. That's already worked in a minor way and could be done much more of. The World Bank, in my view, should not be lending money, but it should be spreading consulting services around the world on a competitive basis with Deaton and McKinsey and anyone else. Now, what all of these things have in common is, in the words of Jagdish Bhagwati at Columbia, this is aid for and not aid in, okay? So you're doing things in our countries which will help poor countries in the world, instead of taking money to them and building schools or hospitals or giving governments money to do what they want to do with it. That's the sort of aid that I think doesn't work. Let me give you the main argument. I don't think that the problem in poor countries is lack of money. And let me just give you an example. It's certainly true that in India and in much of Africa, for example, if you had better health or better education systems, which everybody wants to see, they would cost more money than the government is currently spending. You cannot do much better than they're doing with the amount of money they're spending. So money is a necessary condition for improvement. The trouble is, it's not a sufficient condition for improvement. And the argument here is that more money on those services would not produce better services. You'd just get more people being paid more not to show up to work. Or you just get an expanded private sector where there was more money for health, but it's still not regulated, and anyone can set up and practice. And the big constraint here is the inability of the state to have the capacity to regulate a health sector and education system, to make people run up to work, to deliver quality education and health care. So I like to say something that I think we tend to forget about in rich countries, which is just how much we owe to government. If you imagine a total government shutdown, you know, you close Whitehall and all local governments and things, think of what you would lose. And all these things like police, defense, roads, law, health and pensions, I mean, a whole list of things the government does. Taking that away, that would be like turning Britain into a really poor country overnight. Because I think that's one of the big differences between rich and poor countries. It's functioning government. So what, to me, is the crucial thing is missing is this sort of contract between the government and the governed, where the governed pay their taxes and the government gives you services in return. That contract, to me, is seriously undermined by large quantities of foreign aid coming in from abroad. I don't think small quantities matter very much. In India, I think it's trivial, because it's a tiny share of GDP. But there are 30, 40 African countries that get more than 10% of national income from abroad every year. There's a whole bunch of countries in Africa who for 30 years have received almost all government revenue from aid agencies. They're not raising any money from their populations at all. If you're not raising any money from your population, you have no incentive to do anything for the population. All you're going to do is make sure you stay sweet with the aid agency or whoever's providing the money. I'm not claiming that all aid doesn't work. There are obviously projects that work. There are many people, millions of people, who are alive because of antiretroviral drugs who would otherwise be dead, and those were provided by donors. But all of that aid, even that aid that's saving lives, is undermining state capacity in the countries in where that's happening. You get a health system that is designed from abroad or designed by the Gates Foundation and not designed in response to the needs of ordinary people. Thank you very much.